At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States stood apart from the chaos unfolding in Europe. The country had emerged from the Spanish-American War as a rising power, confident, prosperous, and deeply committed to the idea of staying out of foreign entanglements. President Woodrow Wilson, a man of intellect and idealism, believed that America's destiny was to lead by example, not by the sword. For generations, Americans had lived by a simple philosophy: this is Europe's war, not ours. When the Great War erupted in 1914, a conflict fueled by alliances, imperial ambitions, and centuries of rivalry, the United States declared neutrality. The nation watched as Europe descended into madness, trenches carved across France, skies filled with the roar of new machines of death, and entire cities reduced to rubble. But neutrality was never easy to maintain. America's heart may have been distant from the battlefields, but its economy and conscience were not. As the war dragged on, U.S. businesses supplied food, weapons, and raw materials, largely to Britain and France. Slowly, the lines between neutrality and involvement began to blur. By 1915, the Atlantic Ocean had become a battlefield. Germany's new weapon, the U-boat, a stealthy submarine, prowled beneath the waves, sinking ships without warning. On May 7, 1915, one such submarine torpedoed a British passenger liner, the Lusitania. Nearly 1,200 people were killed, including 128 Americans. The news shocked the nation. Across the U.S., outrage grew. Yet President Wilson remained cautious. He called for restraint, insisting, "America is too proud to fight." Still, the seeds of anger had been planted. For the next 2 years, Wilson walked a tightrope, balancing peace with principle. His re-election campaign in 1916 was built on a promise: he kept us out of war. And for a time, it worked. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. By early 1917, Germany faced desperation. Surrounded by enemies and running out of resources, the German High Command made a fateful decision: to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Every ship bound for Britain, no matter its flag, would be a target. They believed they could starve Britain into surrender before America had time to react. It was a deadly gamble. Then, in February 1917, a secret communication changed everything. It was called the Zimmermann Telegram, an intercepted message from Germany's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, to Mexico. The telegram promised that if Mexico joined Germany in war against the United States, it would be rewarded with the return of lost territories: Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the British intercepted and shared it with the U.S., the public was stunned. "We propose an alliance between Germany and Mexico. Make war together, make peace together, the recovery of the lost territory." The American people felt betrayed. The threat was no longer distant. The war had reached their doorstep. By March 1917, German submarines were sinking American ships almost weekly. The final blow came when Wilson stood before Congress on April 2, 1917, his voice steady but solemn: "The world must be made safe for democracy." Those words marked the moment America stepped into history's deadliest conflict. On April 6, 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany. For the first time in its history, America was sending its sons across the ocean to fight in a European war. The nation, once isolated and inward-looking, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of the world. But the road ahead would be long and costly. The U.S. Army was small, unprepared, and untested. To transform a peaceful nation into a global military force would require the mobilization of millions. Not just soldiers, but workers, families, and the entire American spirit. The Great War had begun for the United States. And it would change the country, and the world, forever. When the United States entered the Great War in April 1917, it was a nation unprepared for the scale of what lay ahead. The U.S. Army, barely 120,000 men strong, was smaller than those of Portugal or Romania. The country had no vast arsenal, no unified war industry, no tradition of fighting in Europe's grand conflicts. And yet, within months, America began to transform itself. From a peaceful republic into a global war machine. It began with mobilization, the greatest organizational effort the young republic had ever attempted. President Woodrow Wilson signed the Selective Service Act on May 18, 1917. Overnight, millions of young American men found themselves answering the call. Draft boards sprang up in every city and town. By war's end, nearly 24 million men had registered, and over 2.8 million were drafted into service. The army that marched to war was not a professional force, it was a citizens' army. Farmers, factory workers, students, and clerks traded their overalls for uniforms. They came from every corner of America, from the farmlands of Kansas to the tenements of New York, united under a single banner, the cause of democracy. Training camps sprang up across the nation, places like Camp Funston in Kansas and Camp Meade in Maryland, where raw recruits were drilled from sunrise to sunset. They learned to march, shoot, dig trenches, and survive in the mud and chaos of modern warfare. It was grueling, exhausting, and transformative. General John J. Pershing, the man chosen to lead the American Expeditionary Forces, insisted on discipline and independence. He refused to let American troops be simply absorbed into British and French units. "We came to fight as Americans," he said, "and we shall be organized as Americans." But the battle for victory was not fought only in the trenches. It was fought in the hearts, homes, and factories of America itself. In Washington, the government created new wartime agencies to direct the national effort. The War Industries Board, led by Bernard Baruch, coordinated production, converting factories that once made cars and consumer goods into plants producing rifles, uniforms, and artillery shells. In the fields, farmers answered the call to feed the fighters. The Food Administration, under Herbert Hoover, urged Americans to conserve. Slogans appeared everywhere: "Food will win the war." Citizens observed "Meatless Mondays" and "Wheatless Wednesdays." It wasn't just about rationing, it was about patriotism through sacrifice. And on the streets, the message of war echoed through posters, newspapers, and films. The Committee on Public Information, led by George Creel, launched one of the most powerful propaganda campaigns in American history. Artists and filmmakers turned patriotism into an art form. Everywhere you looked, Uncle Sam pointed his finger, "I want you for U.S. Army." Songs like "Over There" filled the airwaves, while silent films portrayed German soldiers as ruthless villains. The message was clear: this was not just a war for territory, it was a war for civilization itself. Behind the scenes, another revolution was taking place, one that would forever change American society. With millions of men overseas, women stepped into roles they had never been allowed to fill. They worked in shipyards, steel mills, and munitions factories. They drove ambulances, joined the Red Cross, and served as nurses near the front lines. For many, it was their first taste of independence and equality. Their contribution was undeniable. By the end of the war, President Wilson himself would point to women's service as proof that they deserved the right to vote. The struggle for suffrage, which had raged for decades, gained unstoppable momentum, culminating in the 19th Amendment just 2 years after the war's end. At the same time, the war exposed divisions at home. Immigrants from Germany faced suspicion and harassment. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. German-language books were banned in schools. Across the nation, patriotism sometimes turned to intolerance. But for African Americans, the war brought both hope and heartbreak. Over 350,000 black soldiers served in segregated units, often relegated to labor battalions or support roles. Yet many saw the uniform as a symbol of progress, proof of loyalty and courage. Among them were the legendary Harlem Hellfighters, an all-black regiment that fought longer on the front lines than any other American unit. They returned home as heroes in France, but still faced racism and segregation in their own country. The contradiction would ignite a new movement, a demand for civil rights that would echo for generations. To fund the war, the government launched massive liberty loan drives. Celebrities, athletes, and politicians urged Americans to do their bit, to buy bonds that would support the troops. Millions contributed. Even schoolchildren collected coins to help win the war. The entire nation was mobilized, not just its army, but its spirit. In just over a year, America had accomplished the impossible. It had built an army of 4 million men, produced millions of tons of supplies, and shipped them across an ocean plagued by German submarines. It had unified an often divided nation around a single powerful purpose. By the spring of 1918, the first waves of American soldiers, the doughboys, began to arrive in France. They were inexperienced, but full of energy and optimism. To the weary Allies, they were a sign of hope, fresh strength in a war that had drained Europe of life and spirit. General Pershing knew the cost that awaited them. Modern warfare was unlike anything America had ever faced: machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and relentless artillery. But he also knew that these young men represented something far greater than military might. They carried with them the ideals of liberty, democracy, and a belief that the world could be made new again. America had awakened. The factories thundered, the flags waved, the songs of patriotism filled the streets. From the smallest towns to the biggest cities, every heart beat to a single rhythm, a rhythm of purpose, sacrifice, and belief. Soon, that rhythm would echo across the battlefields of Europe. The United States was ready to go over there. In the summer of 1917, the first American troops, known to the world as the Doughboys, set sail for Europe. Their destination, the battlefields of France. Their mission, to help end the most devastating war the world had ever known. Most had never traveled beyond their home states. They were farmers, factory workers, school teachers, suddenly transformed into soldiers crossing a dangerous ocean. Beneath them, German submarines prowled the depths, hunting for troop ships. Every wave carried a whisper of danger. When they arrived, the French people welcomed them as saviors. Parisians cheered as long columns of American soldiers marched down cobblestone streets, singing songs of home. They were a sight of fresh energy and confidence in a war-weary land. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, knew the world was watching. He promised that U.S. troops would fight as an independent American army, not merely as reinforcements for the exhausted Allied forces. His words were simple and proud. Lafayette, we are here. A tribute to the French hero who had once helped America win its own independence. The American soldiers faced a war unlike anything their nation had ever seen. Europe was a landscape of devastation, trenches stretching for hundreds of miles, where men lived, fought, and died in mud and misery. They learned quickly the cruel reality of modern warfare: machine guns that cut down entire companies in seconds, poison gas drifting silently across no man's land, artillery barrages that turned the earth into fire. The first major engagement of American forces came in the spring of 1918, the Battle of Cantigny. It was small by European standards, but it proved that American troops could fight and win. The success at Cantigny lifted Allied morale and silenced critics who doubted the untested army. But the real test was yet to come. In the summer of 1918, Germany launched a massive offensive, a final gamble to end the war before American strength could fully arrive. The Germans advanced toward Paris. The French lines buckled. The outcome of the entire war hung in the balance. That's when the Americans stepped in. At the Battle of Château-Thierry, and later at Belleau Wood, U.S. Marines and soldiers fought with ferocity that shocked even their allies. When French commanders urged them to retreat, Marine Captain Lloyd Williams famously replied, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." The Battle of Belleau Wood became legendary. For 3 weeks, under relentless machine gun fire, the Marines advanced through fields of wheat and forests shattered by shellfire. When it was over, they had driven the Germans out, at a terrible cost. Nearly 10,000 Americans were killed or wounded. But their courage earned them a new name, from the Germans themselves. Teufelsschund, the Devil Dogs. By the fall of 1918, American troops were arriving in Europe at a staggering rate, nearly 10,000 men a day. Their presence changed everything. The Allies, once on the brink of exhaustion, now had the numbers and momentum to strike back. Under Pershing's command, the AEF prepared for its greatest challenge: the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest and bloodiest operation in U.S. military history. Map animation: arrows moving across the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. Beginning on September 26, 1918, more than 1.2 million American soldiers took part in a massive push to break the German lines. The fighting raged for 47 days through forest, hills, and trenches, in rain and mud so thick it swallowed men and horses alike. Artillery thundered day and night. Machine guns swept the fields. Gas shells filled the air with death. The Americans advanced yard by yard, at terrible cost. Among them were stories of extraordinary heroism. Corporal Alvin C. York, a humble farmer from Tennessee, became one of the most celebrated American soldiers of the war. During a single engagement, York and a handful of men captured 132 German soldiers, almost entirely by himself. He would later receive the Medal of Honor. Archival photo of York, faint reading of his words. "I didn't want to kill any more than I had to, but it was either them or us." By early November, the Germans were collapsing. Exhausted, starving, and facing the unstoppable arrival of fresh American troops, they began to retreat. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. For the United States, the victory had come at a heavy price. Over 116,000 Americans were dead, and more than 200,000 wounded. Many never returned home the same. Yet their sacrifice had changed history. In just 18 months, America had gone from isolation to global power, from a nation watching the world to a nation shaping it. When the doughboys came home, they were greeted as heroes. Parades filled the streets of New York, Chicago, and Washington. But behind the celebration was a quiet question: what had all this meant? Had the war truly made the world safe for democracy? And what kind of nation would America become, now that it had tasted the power of global leadership? For the men who fought over there, the war was more than battles and glory. It was the loss of innocence, a journey into the heart of modern warfare. They had seen the worst humanity could create, and they had answered it with courage. The American Expeditionary Forces had done their duty. They had turned the tide of a world at war. But the peace that followed would prove just as difficult to win. November 11, 1918. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. After 4 years of unimaginable destruction, the guns finally fell silent. Across Europe, bells rang, crowds cheered, and soldiers embraced one another with disbelief. The Great War, the war to end all wars, had come to an end. For the American soldiers, the doughboys, it was a moment of exhaustion, relief, and sorrow. They had crossed an ocean, fought through the mud and fire of the Western Front, and helped turn the tide of history. But as the celebration began, the cost of victory loomed like a shadow over the jubilant world. The price of victory was steep. More than 116,000 Americans had been killed, nearly half of them to disease rather than bullets. Another 200,000 were wounded, their bodies and minds scarred forever. Across Europe, the numbers were almost beyond comprehension: 16 million dead, 20 million injured. The scale of human suffering had changed how the world viewed war itself. As the armistice took effect, the American soldiers who had survived began the long journey home. Their uniforms were tattered, their boots worn, but their spirits were strong. For them, the war was over, but the memories would never fade. Ships crowded with troops crossed the Atlantic once more, carrying not just men, but stories of courage, fear, and brotherhood. When they reached home ports in New York, Boston, and San Francisco, they were greeted with wild celebration. Parades filled the streets. Flags waved from every window. Bands played "Over There" and "Yankee Doodle." The heroes had returned, yet behind the joy, America faced a quiet reckoning. The war had changed everything: the economy, society, and the nation's sense of itself. Factories that had once produced weapons now struggled to shift back to peace. Millions of soldiers came home looking for work that no longer existed. Inflation rose, wages fell, and strikes swept through cities across the country. And while the nation celebrated victory, another invisible enemy began to spread: the influenza pandemic of 1918. As the soldiers returned, so did the flu. It killed more people worldwide than the war itself, an estimated 50 million lives. In America, over 675,000 perished. Streets were empty, schools were closed, and funerals became daily rituals. The war that was meant to end all wars had left behind a trail of grief that no victory parade could erase. Meanwhile, across the ocean, President Woodrow Wilson was preparing for a different kind of battle, the battle for peace. In January 1918, before the war even ended, Wilson had outlined his vision for a new world order, the 14 points. His dream was simple, yet revolutionary. A peace built not on punishment, but on principle. Freedom of the seas. Open diplomacy. The right of nations to self-determination. And, above all, a new organization, the League of Nations, that would preserve peace through collective security. When Wilson arrived in Europe for the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, he was greeted as a hero. Crowds chanted his name, calling him the savior of the world. No American president had ever carried such moral authority on the world stage. But inside the conference halls of Paris, the reality was far harsher. The Allied leaders, Britain's David Lloyd George, France's Georges Clemenceau, and Italy's Vittorio Orlando, wanted vengeance, not vision. France, in particular, demanded justice for the devastation Germany had caused. Clemenceau, the Tiger of France, looked at Wilson's idealism and said bitterly, "God gave us the 10 Commandments, and we broke them. Wilson gives us the 14 points, we shall see." In the end, the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was a compromise, one that satisfied no one completely. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, to disarm, and to pay enormous reparations. The map of Europe was redrawn, old empires dissolved, and new nations born. Wilson succeeded in establishing his League of Nations, but it came at a price. Many believed the treaty sowed the seeds of future conflict, a peace built not on reconciliation, but resentment. When Wilson returned home, he faced a storm of opposition. The U.S. Senate, led by Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, refused to approve the Treaty of Versailles. Many Americans feared that joining the League of Nations would drag the country into more foreign wars. After all, they had fought to make the world safe for democracy, not to police it forever. Wilson refused to compromise. He embarked on a cross-country train tour to rally public support, delivering speeches that moved crowds to tears. But the strain proved too much. In October 1919, he collapsed from a massive stroke. 4 months, the president was incapacitated, hidden from public view as his wife, Edith Wilson, quietly managed the affairs of government. In the end, the Senate voted against the treaty. America would never join the League of Nations, the very institution Wilson had envisioned to ensure peace. The United States returned to its familiar stance, isolationism. The people were tired of war, tired of sacrifice. They wanted to rebuild, to forget the horrors of Europe and focus again on home. Yet the world had changed, and so had America. The Great War had reshaped the nation's identity. Women had gained the right to vote. African American veterans returned determined to fight for civil rights. The United States had emerged as an economic powerhouse, its industries booming, its influence global. But beneath the optimism of the coming Roaring Twenties, the scars of the war remained, hidden in the hearts of those who had seen too much, for the mothers who never saw their sons return, for the soldiers who left a part of themselves in the trenches. For a generation that learned both the triumph and the tragedy of modern war, peace came with a heavy price. The guns had fallen silent. But the echoes of their thunder would shape the century to come. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world tried to heal. But the Great War had left scars that no treaty could erase, scars that reshaped nations, societies, and the human spirit itself. For America, it was a moment of reckoning. The country had gone to war to make the world safe for democracy. And though victory had been won, the world it returned to was not the same, nor was America. The soldiers came home as heroes, the saviors of Europe, the liberators of a weary world. But behind the parades and the marching bands, many carried invisible wounds. They called it shell shock then, the trembling hands, the sleepless nights, the haunting memories of machine gun fire and falling friends. No one yet understood what we now call PTSD. These young men had seen the face of modern warfare, and it had changed them forever. The nation itself had changed, too. The United States emerged from the war not just as a participant, but as a global power. Its factories had fueled the Allied victory, its industries now dominated the world economy, and its banks became the new center of international finance. For the first time in history, the balance of power had shifted across the Atlantic, from the old empires of Europe to the new strength of America. The 1920s would become a decade of transformation, a time of roaring prosperity, cultural revolution, and moral uncertainty. The war had unleashed both the best and the worst of human ambition. Women, having proven their strength and independence during wartime, finally won the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. They cut their hair, stepped into the workforce, and redefined what it meant to be American. African American veterans, having fought for democracy abroad, returned home determined to claim equality at home. Their courage helped spark the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural explosion of black art, music, and literature that would forever change American identity. And yet, not all the changes were for the better. The war's end brought economic dislocation, racial tension, and fear. In 1919, race riots erupted across American cities. The Red Scare swept the nation, a wave of paranoia about communists and radicals. America, once united in war, found itself divided in peace. Immigration from Europe surged, and so did isolationism. Many Americans felt betrayed by the world's chaos and longed to turn inward again, to focus on prosperity, comfort, and the illusion that the horrors of Europe could never touch them again. The Roaring Twenties became an era of contrast, of jazz and joy, but also of denial and forgetting. While the cities danced to the rhythms of progress, the shadows of war still lingered in the background. Unspoken, but never gone. In Europe, the peace Wilson had dreamed of began to unravel. The League of Nations, born from his vision, struggled to enforce its ideals without the participation of the United States. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles and crippled by reparations, seethed with resentment. Across the continent, economic depression, political extremism, and nationalism began to rise again. In the 1920s and 1930s, those tensions would give birth to a new nightmare: the rise of Adolf Hitler, fascism in Italy, and militarism in Japan. The world had ended one great war, only to begin walking toward another. For many Americans, it felt like the Great War had been a mistake, a costly intervention in a conflict that solved nothing. But history would show that the war had done something profound. It had awakened the United States to its destiny as a world leader. The isolation that followed the war would not last. When the world descended into another global conflict just 2 decades later, it would again be American soldiers and American ideals that came to the rescue of freedom. But before that next chapter began, the legacy of World War I lived on in ways large and small. It lived in the poetry of Wilfred Owen and John McCrae, who gave voice to the sorrow of a lost generation. It lived in the monuments and memorials built across the country, from small-town statues to the grand tomb of the unknown soldier, dedicated in 1921 at Arlington National Cemetery. That tomb became a symbol, not just of one man, but of every soldier whose name and story were lost in the chaos of war. It reminded America that freedom had a cost, and that some would pay it in silence. The Great War changed language, art, technology, and geopolitics. It gave rise to modern medicine, aviation, and mechanized warfare. It ended empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the German, and the Russian, and redrew the map of the modern world. And for the United States, it marked the beginning of a new identity, not a distant observer, but a central player on the global stage. From the ashes of the trenches rose the America of the 20th century, powerful, modern, and confident. But behind that confidence lay the memory of a war that had promised peace and delivered heartbreak. World War I was supposed to end war itself. Instead, it became the opening act of a century defined by it. But through all the tragedy and transformation, one truth remained: the belief that freedom, justice, and democracy were worth fighting for. That belief, born in the mud of France, carried home across the Atlantic, and enshrined in the heart of America, still endures. 100 years later, the echoes of the Great War still whisper in our world, in every soldier's oath, in every peace we try to preserve, and in every lesson we struggle to remember. Because history, as the veterans of that first terrible war would tell us, is never really past. It lives on, in us.